Welcome to Praxis, a podcast where we explore how to practice and embody the way of Jesus in our everyday lives. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen. Today we're talking about another one of our core values as a church, which is participation. We want to be a church that steps beyond just weekend attendance and into active participation, knowing that the church is the sum total of everyone's efforts. In this episode, we're going to talk about what gets in the way of participation, why it's important for our formation, and we highlight some of the primary ways people can participate in our church community. So that's where we're headed. Here is episode 5 of Praxis.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Mac.
I'm Katie.
And I'm Cameron.
So we're sitting here, and Katie, you have a interesting shirt on. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, it's neon green, and it says "Brave like Evan." We have some neighbors, the Renickies, and their 10-year-old is currently battling brain cancer. And today is his last day of radiation, and so the community. His mom is also a teacher at Ixonia's school. She's actually my daughter Millie's teacher and Cameron's daughter Gwen's teacher. And so the school and the community have sort of rallied around them in lots of different ways. But one of the ways was to buy T-shirts and yard signs, and we're all wearing them today in support of his last day of radiation.
I love that. Well, for our listeners, if you guys think about Evan, you guys can be praying for him and his family. That's awesome. Cameron, how are you doing today?
Doing good.
Yeah?
It's a beautiful morning. A little snowy.
You know what I did this morning, Cameron?
What?
My dad, for Christmas, he gave me this gift. It's a winter hat with like an LED light attached, like embedded in it.
It sounds like a dad gift.
Yeah, it is.
From a dad to a dad.
Yeah, so I charged this headlamp that's embedded in this winter hat, and I got up early this morning while it was still dark out, and I took our dog Beacon for like a long walk and gave this headlamp a good test run.
So can I tell you what I thought you were going to say?
Oh.
I thought you were going to say you put on the headlamp hat, got in your cold plunge, and accidentally got shocked.
No.
Okay.
That didn't happen.
Okay.
I went for a walk with Beacon, our dog, with the headlamp. It worked great. And then I did a cold plunge, and I feel great. I feel awake and alert.
Nice.
So I'm in a good place.
That's awesome.
Did you have the hat on for the cold plunge?
Yes. Yes, I did. So, well, let's jump in. We're in a series right now where we are talking about our core values as a church. Brené Brown says we can't live into values that we can't name. So what we're kind of trying to do in this series is name our values as a church so that we can better live into them. In our last episode, we talked about spirit sensitivity. If our listeners haven't checked that out yet, we want to encourage you to do that. But today we want to name a third core value of our church, and it's participation. We want to be a church that steps beyond weekend attendance into active participation. And here's the key, knowing that the church is the sum total of everyone's efforts.
Yeah, so to really kind of cast vision for what this looks like, what does it look like to have 100% participation in a church? I think a really good place to start might be the early church. I had the privilege of preaching to our congregation this past spring on Acts 2, and I love the passage in Acts 2 that I was able to teach on because it gives us a really cool vision of the early church. And when we look at the early church, what we see is a body of people that does life together. That's the vision or the phrase that kept coming to my mind when I was studying the passage and praying about it. We see a body of people that wants to follow Jesus, and they look a lot like a family. They kind of bring all of who they are to the table. They link arms, they walk alongside each other, and they just sort of set up this new way of life. And I think this is the vision of the church in the New Testament. It's one where everyone is participating. Everyone is the church. It's not just a building where people, quote, go to church. There's not a real difference between the pastor and the people who go to church. You don't have this idea that like the clergy are the professionals who do all the work. And they're the ones who really hear from God, and then everyone else just kind of sits back as they are ministered to. You don't have, I guess, another way of looking at it is like an 80-20 rule, where the professionals or certain people who are really invested in the church do 80% of the work and everyone else does 20% of the work. You really just have kind of this group of people going, let's do life together in the way of Jesus. Like, let's do life differently than the way we have done it before. And I kind of picture them just looking around and going, okay, like, let's figure this out. You study the word and help teach. You can make meals. You can collect money and distribute it to those in need. And they just sort of divide up duties and walk alongside each other. And I think this is God's vision of everyone leveraging their God-given gifts for the benefit of community. What about you guys? What does participation look like to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think you did a great job summarizing it, that the vision of the New Testament is simply that everyone who follows Jesus is leaning in and participating in the life of the community as a contributing member. I think one of the things I would name is just that this involves going beyond weekly attendance. And I think attendance is really important. I think we all do, and we'll say more about that in a bit. At least I hope to. But while attending a church is important, it's probably not enough. Merely attending a church service, a few times a month isn't what we mean by participation. That's not what you're talking about as you summarize what people are doing in the New Testament. And I think this may already be challenging the way some people think about belonging to a church. I suspect that many people associate the church they belong to with simply attending, the place that I attend occasionally, rather than actually participating in the life of the community. It's sort of like how I'm a Packers fan. Like the Packers are kind of the team that I like. I don't like any other teams more than the Packers.
You were pretty sour like a couple months ago.
That's what I mean. Yeah. Like, I'll often use the word we language when they win a game, like, oh, we crushed the Bears or whatever. But yeah, I avoided watching them for the first several months of the season because they pretty much sucked. And now it's getting a little bit more exciting, so I'm tuned in. But that kind of captures it. I'm a Packers fan, but they're the team I root for. But in the end, it's like I'll watch them when it's convenient for me. I haven't attended a game in years. You know what I mean? And I think that's kind of how church is sort of approached for many people in our culture today. It's a place they attend. It's a loose voluntary association, and they can kind of dip in and dip out based on their convenience.
Yeah, because there's always a gap between a stated value that we'd be living out perfectly in an ideal world, and then the real world around us and our ability to live into it and all the factors that kind of keep us from being able to do that. And while this is a value for us, there are some gaps. Now, I do want to name there are a lot of ways people do participate in our community. Like we had a volunteer appreciation dinner earlier this summer, and there were 120 total people there and 180 invites sent out. So there's lots of people leaning in ways beyond just showing up and attending on a Sunday morning, which is really exciting. And there's a lot to celebrate. But we also haven't fully arrived. And because there are lots of factors that keep people from participating. I mean, I work here, and it can be hard to participate all the time because there's just life and things get in the way.
Yeah, so we all agree that participation is important, right? I don't know that anyone would say participation is not a good thing. But as you just touched on, Cameron, the ideal and the reality can be two very different things. So what are some of those variables that you guys would say are at play here that make actual participation difficult?
One that comes to my mind is consumerism. We live in a very consumeristic culture, and this impacts how people, I think, relate to the church and, quite frankly, how the church has come to operate and organize itself. So let's talk about spaghetti sauce for a moment. Okay, so it used to be the case that if you wanted to get some spaghetti sauce, you'd go to the grocery store, and there was one kind of spaghetti sauce, plain. Mm-hmm. And there were two main brands, Prego.
And Ragu.
Yep. And then what happened is Campbell's, who owned Prego at the time, started to do some taste test studies. And they made a chunky sauce. And what they discovered is that people really liked that chunky sauce more than the plain sauce. And then they started doing more and more and more of these studies. And fast forward, that was in like the early 80s. Fast forward, 40 years, and you go to the grocery store and it's not just plain sauce. You have an entire aisle of different kinds of spaghetti sauce with all sorts of different brands. And that's just one aisle. That same dynamic has happened with literally every product that's profitable. Toothpaste, deodorant, like
Oreos.
Yes. Thank you. Now, at the time that Campbell's was running their own studies, the church was doing a similar thing. They started running their own, within the church growth movement and the attractional church model, they began to run some of their own, basically taste test studies. What kind of preaching do people like? Right? Is it expositional? Is it topical? What kind of worship do people like? Is it contemporary, traditional, or a blend? What kind of kids programming do they like? What kind of small groups do they prefer? What kind of service opportunities do they enjoy the most? And what happened is the primary energy of the church shifted from making disciples who join God's work in the world to providing religious goods and services that people enjoy consuming. And right?
So are you saying it's bad to play worship songs that people enjoy?
That's exactly what I'm saying, Cameron. What I'm saying is the primary energy shifted from multiplying disciples to now creating products that people can consume. And in its worst manifestation, you have churches who are actually competing with each other, who offers the best sort of religious goods and services to attract the same group of people. We're competing for people to come. Is this making sense?
Yeah, it is. And it actually makes me think of when I started here, one of the things that really surprised me is that churches have a business profile on Google. Like they're treated just like every other business where you can go on Google and write reviews. And I had a conversation with someone who said, yeah, if you want your church to get more hits online, you need to be going on and interacting with people's reviews, like responding to them, just as any other business would do.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, and I want to be clear. I don't think that we can escape this reality. We live in a consumeristic culture, and we need to be cognizant of that. I don't think we can completely remove ourselves from that dynamic, but it is something to be aware of. And I think consumerism is detrimental to participation. It doesn't invite people to lean in and give of themselves. It invites them to interact in a very different way. So that's one thing I would point out that gets in the way of participation is this default towards consumerism.
Yeah, and I think that in our culture, we're like raised, not to be all conspiracy theorist, but we're raised and manipulated to be really good consumers where we think we know what we want and that if I get what I want, that's what will make me happy. But often the thing that brings the most joy in life aren't the things that I just wrote on a wish list or a Christmas list, but are things that are difficult or outside of what I even knew that I needed.
Yep. Yeah. Going back to this idea of this is how people enter a church. We had a visitor this weekend, and I was talking with them in the foyer afterwards, and it was a couple, and this woman goes, I'm kind of a church snob. I said, oh, well, what do you mean by that? She's like, well, I go to a lot of churches, and I know exactly what I'm looking for. And I was just like, well, I hope you find that at some point, because but you get what I'm saying? Like she's orienting with like almost like a coffee snob. Like I really know my coffees. Like this is the framework she's bringing to attending our church on the weekend is like, I'm kind of a church snob. I'm kind of refined in my tastes. And I really want to challenge that, I had another couple who I was talking to recently. They're kind of looking for a church, and they kept quoting Stuart Briscoe, who is a very famous pastor, a remarkable guy in our area for a long time, served faithfully, and they kind of named their affinity for him. And yet they've been hopping around to different churches for a long time. So I just quoted Stuart. I said, Stuart said, go ahead and shop for a church, but don't shop too long because you're never going to find a perfect one. Get into a church and start participating. What else would you guys name as like inhibitors to a participation?
Well, I think related to that is, I think a variable is we as people don't like to get out of our comfort zone often. Like there's kind of an addiction to comfort and keeping things easy, and life is so busy. And so it's easy just to kind of show up and engage as we sit there in the seats, but then just kind of like leave because it takes a lot of vulnerability to put yourself out there. And whether that's serving or joining a small group or whatever it is, like sometimes you don't know how to do that perfectly or don't know how it's going to work out, or you might find a group that maybe doesn't quite fit what you feel like your needs are, or so it takes some vulnerability to kind of put yourself out there.
Yeah. I mean, I can see that. I can relate to that in my own life. I know that there have been seasons where I've tended towards comfort and felt anxiety about getting out of my comfort zone. Just maybe I felt like I didn't know how to do something, or I don't know. There are lots of reasons.
Yeah, Cameron, man, as you name that, I think this is one of the things that helps me have grace for people, just recognizing that maybe even showing up to church on a weekend is a stretch for some people outside of their comfort zone. I mean, they don't know what they're going to expect. Who are they going to meet? Who's going to try to talk with them? And then every step of participation from there, getting involved in a serve team or participating in kids ministry, whatever it is often a stretch outside the comfort zone. And yet maybe the challenge is this is how we grow. We don't grow without kind of stepping outside the places where we're addicted to comfort, and that's where God often does his best work. So I think that's an important one to name.
Yeah. Another one I would name is busyness. This one almost feels so obvious that I sort of question whether it's even worth mentioning, but I think it's true. We are a really busy people. You think back to let's say 200 years ago when we were largely like an agrarian society, right? We were like farmers and the economy was largely based on agriculture. Just think about how different the pace of life would be. It certainly would be hard work. Absolutely. They probably had a lot less leisure time than we do now. But I would guess that most people spent a lot of their time at home, like tending to the land, maybe going to town to buy food or go to church. But I would think that they were mostly just at home.
Gossiping with their neighbors, maybe. That hasn't changed.
Yeah, maybe there are some things that are similar. But you fast forward and think about how much time we spend now just in the car, driving our kids to sporting events, commuting to work or traveling to work, being involved with different organizations, getting to the gym, the grocery store, running errands, you name it.
Netflix isn't going to watch itself.
Hey, we have Netflix in the car now, right?
Oh my goodness.
Here we are sitting in like early mid-January, and we just got out of Christmas, which is obviously one of the busiest times of the year. And you can't help but notice people are really busy and have I think a hesitation to adding one more thing.
Yes. Dude, you and I, Cameron, you were talking about a book you read. This was probably like a month ago, where like technology was originally designed to like save us time. That was sort of like what people were anticipating, and it's done the exact opposite. Do you remember what we were talking about there?
Yeah, this guy was talking about the washer and dryer. How like when it was originally marketed, it was going to save like stay-at-home moms, which is back in that time when it came about. Give them so much more time. But all that happened was like the expectation of what a stay-at-home mom was supposed to accomplish in a day was raised. So it didn't actually create more time. It just created more jobs.
Yes.
For women to do.
Yeah. And, we can see that with technology for communication, for instance. Communication used to be much slower, but now that we can do it faster, the volume is higher, right? And I think one of the takeaways that I remember in that conversation with you, Cameron, is like, if you become good at email,
you just get more emails.
You just get more emails, right? So I often feel busy. I think we all have we feel busy. But here's my conundrum with this one. We, as a culture, also waste a lot of time. Like I think in a previous episode, I narrated how much time, statistically, how much time we spend on technology. So it's true that we feel busy, and to a certain degree we are busy, but then I think about the fact that I can waste a colossal amount of time on my phone. Right? And so what's underneath this busyness may not just be like I'm really busy, but it could be a matter of priority, that it's not ultimately a busyness issue, it's a priority problem. What do you guys think about that? Am I being too harsh or?
No, I think that's right. I think that there's a lot more that's competing for our attention than maybe was the case 100 or 200 years ago. And so we may just have to be more disciplined to guard our time.
Yeah, because we have the same amount of time that human beings have always had, right? Mm-hmm. And it's up to us to steward our attention and our priorities. And I think you're right. There's just this ridiculously high volume of things that we can give our attention to, which amplifies this feeling of busyness.
Did you say steward or Stuart?
I meant Stuart.
Okay.
Did I say something different?
It just sounded like Stuart.
Okay. Well, maybe that's funny. Okay, I'll name another one. Another one that I would name is church hurt. I had someone, this was a couple years ago, I got done preaching, and this guy comes forward, and he introduces himself, and he says, let's just call him James. And he goes, hi, my name's James. This is my first time at a church in over 2 years, and I really don't want to be here. And I kind of started to chuckle a little bit because I just thought that's like a really funny way to introduce yourself. But so I asked him, I was like, okay, well then what are you doing here? And he starts to share a story. He's working at a huge church in Chicago, on church staff, and the lead pastor got fired for abusive and narcissistic leadership, and he was in proximity to this leader and got abused. He was traumatized by this leader. And after that, he was like, okay, I'm done with big churches, kind of thinking big churches are the problem. So he joined a really small church, and that got really messy, and he just gave up on church. And now it's his first time back in church, moves to the area, and feels like God is telling him to come to Cross Point. And I've gotten to know James really well, but he represents one category of people who may be hesitant to participate because they've experienced real hurt and pain within the walls of a church. And I think there's probably a spectrum here from those who have been abused or have trauma, and maybe those who are just incredibly apathetic or think that church is a waste of time, and everywhere in between. People have frustrations about how church is done or bad experience. You know what I mean? There's probably a whole range. But I think some people are hesitant to participate in a church because of their negative experiences with the church.
Yeah. And that's fair. I would be too if I were him.
Yeah.
So it does feel important to name that.
What else? Any others we'd want to name?
I think another one, like a barrier to experiencing the fruit of participation, is I think we can tend to give up too early. I've noticed in my own life, like I am not great at sticking with things. I kind of jump from thing to thing and hobby to hobby. But I've been really blessed by working in a church, so it's kind of forced me to stick around when things
When was the last time you practiced the fiddle?
It's been a few weeks probably.
Oh, I was expecting
But before
months.
that, it had been months.
Okay.
So,
All
this is
right.
the baby.
Yes. We'll blame it on the baby.
Yes. So I've been really blessed by working in a church because it's forced me to stick around when things were difficult or I got bored or restless. And what I found is there's a lot of fruit that comes from pushing through some of those feelings that make me go, maybe I just don't want to go this week. Like when you have to go, it can actually be really positive to kind of push past that natural tendency to pull away when things get boring or difficult.
Yeah, there's a author named M. Scott Peck. He was a psychologist. He wrote the book The Road Less Traveled, which is kind of his most famous book. But he also wrote a book called The Different Drum, and I remember reading it. It's about community, and he talks about 4 stages of community. So the first one is what he says is pseudo-community, which is basically where people fake it. Like they're being nice and cordial with each other, but they're ignoring their differences or putting distance between those things that could create tension. That's like the first stage. The second stage is chaos. And that's where people stop ignoring those differences and start naming them, and conflict ensues. And at that stage, most people will go back to pseudo-community or leave the community entirely. The third stage, he says, is emptiness, where we basically all recognize how our own egos are at play. We learn how to empty ourselves in love toward one another. And then the final stage, when people practice that long enough, is real community, a real sense of togetherness where we honor differences, work through conflict, etc. And it seems to me, Cameron, what you were kind of narrating is just that a lot of people join a church. There's this kind of honeymoon period, but it's not real community. It's just pseudo community. And then the moment that things get difficult, the moment that relationships get hard, the moment that maybe the church goes through a difficult season, the grass is greener somewhere else. And then they repeat that cycle of pseudo community, chaos, departure. And I just think it's really important to name that devotion to anything assumes difficulty. Commitment assumes some degree of challenge, whether it's marriage or parenting or, growing in a skill or a competency. Real perseverance and sort of a stick-to-itness is required to journey with a group of Jesus followers over an extended period of time.
Yeah, a stick-to-itness. And at the same time, so I agree with all that. And at the same time, we've named that there are situations that are truly unhealthy and dysfunctional, and there are very legitimate reasons to leave a church or any organization.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And so there's probably some discernment there to go, okay, if I feel like not following through, is it because I'm taking on kind of this consumerist attitude of like, well, I didn't like the worship music today, or they're not doing this as well as I would like it to, or, my own comfort or whatever? Or is it something that really is harmful in some ways? And maybe I've tried to lean in, and I feel like it really is the right decision to leave.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there are instances where perhaps the most faithful thing to do is to leave a community. Yeah, so maybe before we close out this section, I want to ask this question. How do church leaders and pastors maybe contribute to these variables that inhibit participation? What do you guys notice?
Well, thinking of the consumerist-oriented churches that we have sort of talked about, not to point fingers at other churches. Obviously, it's something that I think every church needs to be mindful of. But I might say that when you get on stage every week and you sort of become used to having a platform, I could see ego getting in the way, and that ego making it difficult to receive maybe criticism or feedback with humility. Mm-hmm. I could see it being really easy to think, well, I'm the one who gets up there and preaches every week. I'm the reason that hundreds of people are here, in some cases, thousands if we're talking a really big church. And who are you to tell me how to do things differently? If it weren't for me, we wouldn't be as big as we are. Kind of a focus on numbers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that I've been committed to over the last decade is systems thinking, and meaning we're all participating in this web of relationships and influences. And so as I think through some of the things that we just got done talking about, I actually think that church leaders are contributing to every single one, myself included. So with consumerism, churches can organize themselves around providing religious goods and services rather than multiplying disciples. With busyness, we see the church then heaping obligations or opportunities on people that amplify their sense of busyness, right? Comfort zone. We can cater to people staying comfortable and not challenge them to go outside of their comfort zone.
Well, on the other side of that, though, we can also set the bar so high
that they fail.
Yeah, that it's like way too unrealistic.
Right. And church hurt. A lot of church hurt comes from failures among church leaders. Perseverance. I mean, a lot of times we're seeing pastors leave churches prematurely. Or not learning how to handle that chaos well, right? So I think that with each one of these, it's not just turning the table towards attenders or members. We're all in these variables together, having to go, okay, in order to participate alongside one another, we need to recognize these things and work through them together.
And I would think the leadership has, more responsibility than people who show up in helping make sure those systems are in place.
Yes. We all bear responsibility, but probably not equal amounts of responsibility.
Yeah.
I think that's important to name.
So we've named a lot of reasons why participation could feel like an uphill battle. Consumerism, competing priorities, a difficult season of life, busyness, whatever. Why make participation a priority? Like why would we say that participation is a core value for our church?
Well, one thing that comes to mind for me is just that our transformation depends on it. I don't think transformation is just a passive thing where we sort of sit back and God zaps us into Christ-likeness. That's not how it works. It requires our active engagement, us leaning in and surrendering and participating with the work God wants to do. The goal of discipleship is communion with God that results in Christ-likeness that's expressed in loving service to others, and that doesn't happen as I just kind of check out. And every point of data is now suggesting that this is just how it works. I came across this statistic that said that human beings they're learning when it comes to how much they hear, we only remember about 10% of what we hear, okay? Then we remember about 30% of what we see, but 90% of what we do. So 10% of what we hear, 30% of what we see, but we're likely to remember 90% of what we do. And as I start to take that statistic and think about our own formation as people, that to me, that sort of comports. It can be really discouraging on a preaching level to go, okay, people are only going to remember probably less than 10% of the things I say, maybe 30% of the things they see, but 90% of their transformation will come from opportunities to step in and act on their faith and do something in a tangible way.
It makes me think of, in our leadership intensives here at Crosspoint, the way we define repentance is, quote, like an embodied demonstration of trust. And that was a light bulb moment for me when I first heard that definition and then started to teach it because of that word embodied. Like it's this idea that it's less about checking a box in my head and sort of mentally assenting to certain beliefs, kind of listening to a sermon and going, yep, I agree with that, so therefore I'm a Christian. And it's more about living into these truths with our bodies, like actually taking them from our head down into our hands and feet. It can't just be a head thing.
Yeah.
I think another reason why it's important is we need it, but other people also depend on our participation. Like I think of my own life, like if it weren't for people who are willing to sacrifice and lean in and deal with me being an idiot, like I would not even be close to where I am today. But they were willing to.
It can be exhausting, Cameron.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. When I did youth ministry stuff and I'd get crazy students, I'd always think to myself, I deserve whatever it is that's happening to me right now.
This is God's punishment for all of my misdeeds.
Yes. But I needed people who were willing to take their time to sit with me and to walk with me as I grew in my faith.
I think we're all sitting here because people did that for us. Mm-hmm. Like labored alongside of us, dealt with our imperfections, our shadow sides, and sort of walked alongside of us toward maturity and growth.
Yeah. We need other people, and hopefully they also need us.
Yeah, I think it's really easy to think that we're not as far along as we actually might be. But no matter where we're at in our spiritual journey, there's probably people that we can invest in and help grow. Because, we might not be as far along as the greats in our own life who helped us, but we're farther along than other people who need someone to come alongside of them.
Okay, so here's where my mind is at. I think there are some people in our community who are desperate for community, especially coming out of the pandemic. I mean, when the pandemic hit, what happened for a lot of people is all the web of relationships that involved acquaintances disappeared really quickly, and everybody sort of went into the close relationships that they had already established, which meant that people who didn't have close relationships felt way more lonely than those who did. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've been in this precarious place for the last couple of years, gradually reopening, regaining a sense of normal, and those who lack community are really desperate for it. But then there's people who I think have a sense of community. Their life is full of relationships, and they don't really feel the need for more, right? Mm-hmm. And I think there's a tension between those two, because one of the things I hear you naming, Cameron, is other people might need our community. They need to be welcomed in. So what do we do with that? I mean, what do we do with those who need a sense of community and those who feel like they already have it and maybe aren't available to open up space, hospitality for others?
I say we force them.
So coercion and force.
Maybe manipulation.
Always a good strategy.
Yeah. No, I think you can't control. And I think, even having that mindset could very quickly lead to that consumerist mindset that we were talking about earlier. Well, how can we be cooler or have better kids programs that they would like better and want to plug in here? I guess I would say just continue to be faithful to this vision of a community with 100% participation, and trust that those who God is inviting into this community and are receptive to his invitation will join us.
Yeah, and I think there's this place where we engage community because we acknowledge our own need for relationship. We need others to walk alongside of us. And at the same time, we lean in knowing other people need that same thing from us. Right? Like there's a story in Mark 2 where the paralytic gets carried to the feet of Jesus and healed. And it's like there's a sense in which we all need to be carried to the feet of Jesus by those around us. And we all need to learn how to carry other people. It's a both and.
And if we really do this well, like if we really live into the vision of community that we see in Acts 2, for example, I think people will be attracted to it, because what I see in the Bible is something that looks very different from many other communities that I've experienced in my own life. Another one I might share would be that God may not act without us. So this might sound weird when I say it out loud, but let me explain what I mean. It's not necessarily this idea that God needs us. I don't think he's sitting back going, man, if Katie doesn't do X, Y, and Z, my plans to redeem the world are ruined. But he does call us to join with him in his mission to, heal that is broken in the world and redeem that which is not as it should be. And so what that means is for God to carry out his redemptive purpose in the world, the church needs to truly be the church. We're not just a bunch of individual people doing our own thing. The church is the local expression of the kingdom of God here in our community. And again, when we don't capture this vision and all lean into it, what could happen, I think often happens, is kind of an overfunction, underfunction dynamic. So I kind of touched on this earlier, but
what do you mean by that? Overfunction, underfunction? Why don't you explain what that means?
Yeah, I think some people could listen to this podcast and go, yeah, that sounds great. I do want that community. And they could get really passionate about it and then do 80% of the work to create that community. And then everyone else kind of sits back and goes, yeah, that's cool. I can get on board with this. But for whatever reason that we just named above, they think they're not qualified, or they're too busy, or it feels uncomfortable. They can kind of take a back seat. Maybe they think it's the staff's job to do ministry stuff. For whatever reason, they become more of an observer. They might be excited about the idea, but in reality, they end up sort of underfunctioning. So a small percentage of the people do the majority of the work, and the majority of the people end up doing a small percentage of the work. And so you get an over-functioning, under-functioning dynamic, which is really not a healthy system, and it's certainly not what we're going for here at Crosspoint. I think what we want is a community where everyone participates, where everyone knows that they are a gift to this community, regardless of how long they've been coming or how far along they are in their journey of following Christ, but one where everyone is truly invited and equipped and empowered to participate fully in the body of Christ, in this church family. Because that's how God does his work, through his people.
Yeah. So when it comes to overfunctioning and underfunctioning, both the overfunctioner and the underfunctioner are not operating in a healthy way.
Yeah.
Right?
I think that's right.
Because an overfunctioner, while they tend to be rewarded more in our society or culture, are still doing for someone else what that person should be doing on their own. And I think if overfunctioners are going to help contribute to an environment of health, They're going to need to stop doing for other people what those people should and can be doing on their own, which means that certain things, if they risk that, certain things may not happen in a church community unless everyone participates. And this gets at the original point you were making, Katie, which is God may not act without us, right? There may be certain things that God wants to see done in the world that may not happen without a group of people actively participating and faithfully joining what he wants to see accomplished. We see this throughout the Bible. I mean, God could have worked the plan of salvation, the work of redemption on his own. But he chooses to invite Abraham. He chooses to work with Moses and the people of Israel. He chooses to engage the church. He could do it on his own, but he prefers not to. I heard a podcast yesterday, and a famous New Testament scholar pointed out that the word in Romans 8:28, where God works for the good of all of us, is synergeo, which is work, energeo. That's the word there. Okay. But the prefix is with. So it's not work for, it's God works with us. That's the point.
Yeah, the word that comes to my mind is like kingdom bearers, right? God calls us to be kingdom bearers to the world. All right, so we've talked about how many churches are organized in ways that fuel consumption, a few people doing the work while everyone else consumes. So when we look at this church, when we look at Crosspoint, how are we creating a space for people to actively participate? And if, let's say someone is listening to this and kind of wondering, what does participation look like? What would you say? Again, knowing that will depend on the person's unique circumstances and how God might be leading them to get involved.
Yeah, and I hope if you're listening and you aren't a part of our community, this will translate into whatever context you're in. But the first thing I would name, and this is sort of the catch-22, is attendance. We named at the beginning, we sort of named, hey, participation involves going beyond attendance, but it's not less than attendance. Especially in a culture where people who are highly committed to a church are attending less and less. I mean, even really committed members of our community are maybe attending a few times a month, not every single week, right?
Yeah.
And so I think there is maybe the first step to truly belonging and participating in a community is the disciplined commitment of showing up every week. And there's sort of a negative and positive cycle that happens based on attendance that I keep noticing. When people show up every single week, what happens is the pathways for participation open up before them. They feel a deeper sense of connection and relationship in this space. So there's this positive sort of connectivity and participation that opens up before them. Whereas people who attend less frequently or sort of sporadically, what happens is those pathways for participation and those avenues for connection are less and less frequent. They're less and less tangible, and that decreases. It has the impact of decreasing their attendance on a regular basis. And then there's the whole dynamic of even if you do plan on attending, there's a way of attending that is sort of passive, and there's a way of attending that's really fruitful and active. It's one thing to show up on a weekend during the third song and walk into the sanctuary, listen to the message, and leave while Cameron's doing the benediction, right? There's another way of attending, though, where you show up before the service and you interact in the foyer. And during the community time, you're getting to know other people, and maybe you join a serve team on the weekend, greeting, or our safety team or whatever. That's a different way of attending altogether than just sort of showing up and walking out at the end.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's true in our church too when we do community events, that there's a way just to kind of show up and do the thing and then leave. And I think of like this last year, there's a guy that I met at one of the community events we did sometime last winter. And even for me, it was like, I was like, I don't know, like, I feel awkward. I don't know who this is. Like, I don't know if I should be, and I'm like, this is part of my job, and I'm like fairly extroverted. But we got
not awkward at all, I might add.
Right. Well, that's good.
Yeah.
Well, or I just make things so awkward. It's like, there's only, it's only going to go up from there.
Yeah. The bar is low.
This guy is more awkward than me, so I feel really comfortable.
No. He was, yeah, exactly. But then we got to talking, and then we ended up like disc golfing a bunch this summer and became like really good friends. But that's a relationship that I wouldn't have had I not like participated fully in that community event.
Yeah. Yes.
I think that the same thing is true for like groups. Like, there's lots of opportunities to join groups and kingdom communities. And the hard part, of course, is that those take time that we feel like we don't have. But what I've noticed is when people make the time and space to lean into that, they experience community and spiritual growth in a way that they now wouldn't want to give that up because they leaned in.
Yep. Yeah. So, attending, there's events, like I think about our coffee hour where people can participate and get to know new people. There's serving opportunities, serve teams people can be a part of. There's groups, there's ministries people can be engaged in. There's kingdom communities, right? There's all these pathways for participation.
Yeah, and I think, I'll just echo what Cameron said. I think small groups, whether it's a kingdom community or a sermon discussion group, I think those are huge. I've experienced a lot of breakthrough in community in my life. I also would say there's a certain element that just arises organically. Like as you lean in and become connected in a community, you become aware of needs. You become aware of people's challenges that they may be going through or the season of life that they're in, and you're able to just walk through that season with them and meet needs. So if I'm here early and I get to know someone, and then I continue to see them and build a relationship with them, I'm more likely to be aware when they are struggling with maybe a health crisis or loss of a job or some other physical need. And then I'm just able to meet it in an organic way. So the more you show up and become present, the more that we'll just become aware of ways to participate in the family of God, again, by doing life together.
Oh, I think that's so important to name because as a pastor on our team, I'm acutely aware that I cannot organize and administrate all the community events or structures that will provide expression for our church. I can't do that. Mm-hmm. We can't do that. And I think where the real action is exactly what you're naming. There are organized ways to connect in our community and to participate. But some of the best moments are those organic ones that flourish because I'm present and I'm available.
Yeah. Yeah, I've only worked here a little over a year now, and there have been a number of times that I've had someone say to me like, hey, the church should really do this or the church should really do that. And they're often very good ideas, but there's also a lot of times no reason why the person couldn't just do it, If they have connections and they know a need in the community and they want to sort of gather in an organic way, I often say like, yeah, that sounds like a really good idea. We'd love to help support and give you the resources that you need. If you need our building, if you need space, if you need some help from the staff, absolutely. But if that's something that God has laid on your heart and you have other people that are interested in it, let's do it.
Yeah.
So bottom line, participation is a value here at Crosspoint because we're not the church without it, right? We believe that in order to live into the vision that God has called us to, it requires everyone to use their gifts, abilities, and resources in a way that God invites us to. And so we value participation for what it cultivates within the body, but also for the work that it does in each and every person. Because we don't grow as followers of Christ without doing the work of faith. In other words, it's not just that we need you, it's that you need you. Participation is the living out of faith with and in our bodies. So as I think of some next steps we could offer to continue to press into this idea of participation, one might be reflecting on your own experience. Have you been part of church communities where that 80-20 rule seems to be at play? Or where participation is encouraged by all, and there isn't really that over-functioning, under-functioning dynamic? Another one might be ask God how he's inviting you to participate in the body. So if you call Crosspoint home, then reflect on that with Crosspoint in mind. And if not, think about it with whatever church it is that you call home and ask, how is God inviting me to participate? And then I would say maybe reflect on a time that a belief was made real to you by acting on it. So when in your life have you maybe had something that lived in your head, and as you acted it out, it was made real in your hands and feet, in your body. And I think that's where the real transformation happens.
Thanks for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Next time, we're going to press into a fourth core value here at our church, and that is generosity. We want to be a generous church that reflects a generous God. And building on this value of participation, we believe that every disciple of Jesus is to grow and live into living a generous life. We hope you'll tune in, and we will see you next time.
Praxis is recorded and produced at Crosspoint Community Church. You can find out more about this show and our church at crosspointwi.com. If you have any questions, comments, or have any suggestions for future topics, feel free to send us an email. Also, if you enjoy the show, consider leaving a review. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.